So for those who don't know who you are, can you tell us who you are and what it is that you do?
Yeah, so my name is Josh. I live in the Midwest of the United States, and I buy and sell vintage clothing from lots of different places, but then flip it onto eBay as sort of my main business. But I also make YouTube videos about how to identify what is really vintage, how to authenticate true vintage clothing, and sort of get an idea of the history behind it, so that you can be a better buyer or seller for yourself on my YouTube channel. And that is like the bulk of my business. But I am the father of 4 kids, 4 beautiful children, and husband to my wife, Katie. And we live out here in South Central Missouri in the middle of nowhere and somehow are able to do this.
So you said a couple of interesting things there. So the first thing that's really interesting to me is where it is that you're located, because you live in a small town, as do I, but in California, which is going to raise some interesting questions about how we find items when we are thrifting, which I do want to get to eventually. But for now, could you talk a little bit about how it is that you got interested in, is thrifting the correct word? I keep wanting to use that word.
Yeah, thrifting, I guess it's sort of a catch-all at this point, because, I don't just buy from thrift stores. I buy from flea markets, and I buy from private individuals, estate sales. So I guess in some sense, it's sort of a catch-all term that thrifting is what people describe it as. But, I buy and sell. I specifically look and curate items from wherever I can find them, really. I've literally dumpster dived for vintage clothing, and sometimes successfully, but you just look.
Are you talking about the dumpster dives?
I'm talking about specifically, the dumpster dives have been semi-successful. We've found other things. It's sort of anyway, but anywhere I can find it, and so that means I'm always keeping my eyes out, always talking to people, trying to build relationships with people, estate sales, stuff like that. So especially out here, like the small town deal, a lot of people in bigger cities, they have like these things called Goodwill bins, which basically like Goodwill just aggregates everything they aren't selling on their floors and puts them in giant piles and bins, and people just come and dig through them. I don't have any of that around here. So like I have to travel like 3 hours to get to a place like that. There aren't any rag houses. So like I have to be really creative about how and where I find stuff. So it just means I have to, squeeze the most out of every possibility to locate some of these old clothes. So and the internet helps a lot too. So, people have sold me their collections or what they've found, and I get to, buy that and sell that on as I can get it.
How do you become aware of like where these items might be? Like you said, some of the places that you go to find them, but how do you become aware of where those places are in the first place?
Yeah. So out here, where I live, I have to drive probably in any direction 20 minutes just to get to any sort of thrift store or something. And so some of it is I have to just talk to local people. So I didn't grow up in this area, actually. I moved here from the East Coast, from Virginia, after spending most of my adult life in Virginia. And when I moved out here, I had to just start talking to people. And I realized that out here in the Midwest, one super popular thing is flea markets. Like there are like 3 grocery stores in my town, including like a Walmart, but there are 8 or 9 flea markets. And it's sort of part of the culture out here that, because it's not super highly trafficked, there's not tons of, retail stores and stuff like that, that people buy and sell and flip their own items. So it's really common out here that if you live out here, you also have a booth in one of the local flea markets. So what's cool about that is that people are constantly recycling items that are they're just taking up space in their house. They put them out in their little flea market booth, and I swing through and I check them out, and I I've found so many really amazingly interesting things at these flea markets. And most of these people aren't using the internet, so they're not like checking up the prices. It's like pretty good price. But yeah, you have to talk to people to find some of these unusual locations. I've had a buddy who did grow up here, and he's like, "Oh man, like, have you ever been to this thrift store out, 45 minutes away, and like literally in the middle of nowhere?" And I was like, I had no idea it was there. I went, he took me there, and we found, no joke, $30,000 worth of vintage dead stock starter jackets. So like the stuff like people would see the Dallas Cowboys starter jackets from the 90s, and everyone was wearing them back then. Like $30,000 worth of merchandise, no joke. And
I used to have a couple of those jackets. I really love that. Were they like the windbreaker ones?
Yeah, they had the windbreakers, the big sort of puffier ones, a bunch of jerseys. Like, it was crazy. Like, it didn't make any sense to me. The town that he took me to was maybe 200 people, maybe 200. They had $1 General and like a gas station, but it just so happened that there was this random thrift store, and by chance, somebody, I think from Chicago, retired in the area. He died. He had a storage unit from a business I guess he owned in the 90s, and it just all got donated there. And like, it was super bizarre, but you have to have a little bit of luck and, just relationships with people, and they sort of point you in different directions. You tell them what you do. And a lot of times, at least out here, they look out for you and they tip you off. So that's been really helpful being out here in the middle of nowhere.
Is there like a internet resource where you can go, like, I don't know, like a particular website where they tell you like, this is where you can find this or that Goodwill store or anything like that?
Yeah. Well, there's Google, just type in thrift stores around me. I've done that, and that sometimes is helpful. A lot of times there are lots of unhelpful information, but there is like, I'm trying to remember the name of it. I can't think of it off the top of my head, but there is a website that estate sales register their estate sales with. And so you can go search like estate sales near me, and it might even be the name of the website, estatesalesnearme.com or something like that. And they'll tell you, they just get all this huge registry of local estate sales. And so those can be really helpful. So like that website, garage sales can be really awesome. And there's a couple garage sale apps that you can search for on your app, wherever you get apps. And people register their garage sales with that application. And they even search Facebook. So when you like someone who advertises their garage sale on Facebook, it automatically gets added to that application. And so you can use those to varying degrees of success to get an idea of where some of these sort of temporary things are, these temporary sales or estate sales, garage sales, stuff like that. But generally with thrift stores, I just go to Google. And the problem with out here is that some of these people, most of these little thrift stores don't even take credit cards. They haven't discovered the internet, apparently. So like, I know that may not be an issue out in California, probably, but like, I know out here, there's still a handful of stores, like thrift stores that I go to that are cash only, and they still take like local checks. So that's a little annoying, but that also means they're probably not on Google. And so that's actually kind of interesting, because that's how I get sort of the advantage, is that there are all these places that nobody else really knows about, and it's hard to find out about. And if you don't do your due diligence, you'll never hear about it.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. It seems like that's a unique position, because if you're basically able to weed out, so to speak, the lazier people who don't really want to put in the work.
Yeah, absolutely. So the little thrift store out in the middle of nowhere that had $30,000 worth of brand new, like vintage dead stock merchandise, that stuff apparently had sat there for over a year, which means nobody else that nobody else had come through that thrift store that had any thought to say, hey, I could buy all this stuff and sell it. So like I will never divulge. I'm pretty secret on that particular spot, even to this day. I don't really tell anyone about that particular place. But it's crazy because it sat there for a year. Nobody had touched it. And that would not happen in a big city. You know what I mean? Like a big city somebody would have thought to, hey, I can make money off of this, and they're going to buy it all up. But because it's in the middle of nowhere, sometimes these really rare unicorn moments happen, and you're the first one, even if they've sat there for a year, to actually have thought, hey, I can resell this, or this has some value. So yeah, it's pretty cool.
So let's take a step back for a second. So how is it that you became involved in thrifting in the first place? Did you do this in Virginia before you moved to Missouri?
Yeah. I mean, I grew up like a punk kid. So like I always wanted really old, trashy clothes, and I didn't want to spend a lot of money. I wanted stuff that was off the beaten path. So I grew up like finding my wardrobe in thrift stores. It wasn't until my wife started as a little eBay business that she had, like, her cousin had started doing it and buying things from thrift stores and selling it. And this was probably like 5 or 6 years ago. And she started doing it sort of on the side. And I was like, okay, that's cool. Like, I was working in the audiovisual industry as an integrator. And then I looked at like her sales and I was like, oh my gosh, that's like crazy. Like that's just for like what you put into it, what you're getting out of it. That's wild.
And if you don't mind me asking, can you give me a sense of the number? That's up to you.
At the time it was like maybe $1,000 a month.
That's like, not bad.
No, it wasn't. But it wasn't like, but I had always thought in my head that this was sort of like, it's a little bit of hobby money, but like she was just going out to the thrift store a couple times a week. And we lived in Virginia at the time, and in a pretty large area in the Hampton Roads, Chesapeake Bay area. And so I was just really surprised because I was like, I didn't realize you would be doing that well. And so that just kind of got me interested. And I went with her one time, and it's a funny story because at the time I was so clueless about anything. I was just going like, oh, we can buy this. We can buy this. I was just so excited because it was like, this seems so easy. Of course, it's really not that easy. But in like 2015, 2016, I had no idea. And I remember this was like the first time I'd gone thrifting to resell. I reached out. I was in like the women's like blazer section, which is not typically a place you go to make any sort of money. But I went there because I didn't know what I was doing. I pulled out this like knit blazer, and I pulled it out as a joke because I thought it looked frumpy and just kind of ugly. And I said, hey, look at this. Who would wear this? And I looked at the label and I was like, Channel. Who would wear this? No joke.
Channel.
It was Chanel. So like, and my wife's like, you mean Chanel? And I'm like, oh, is that how they spell it? Like so clueless. It turns out that was like it was actually really cool. It was like that it was that item right there that like it clicked for me for a sec. Like obviously I found something that I paid like $5 for, and it was worth hundreds. But so that was cool. But what was really interesting was I remember we picked it up and I was like, I don't know if it's authentic. And this looks old. This doesn't look like something that was just bought yesterday, which is pretty typical of thrift store items. It doesn't typically go from, straight from the department store straight to the thrift store. But I was like, this looks old. And I remember I just started looking, like searching the internet, trying to figure out whether or not A, it was authentic, and B, whether or not like, is this old? It turns out that it was early 1990s, maybe late 80s sample piece that Chanel had probably sent to, one of the high-end department stores in like Norfolk, Virginia, and they had used it sort of as a display. And so it was really interesting, really kind of a rare piece to some degree. I think we ended up selling it for a couple $100 but we couldn't really authenticate it at the time. Websites like realauthentication.com, which does like they will authenticate your high-end clothing for a fee over the internet. They didn't exist really yet. If it did, I couldn't find it. Didn't find anyone that would do it. So finding like an appraiser on the internet to really verify whether or not this item was real was hard to do. It's a lot easier now because of companies like Real Authentication and the Real that will do that for you in the whole process of selling it. So, but I remember that was the piece. It was a really dumb moment for me. I felt really stupid. But like, it was really cool because suddenly I was like sleuthing. I was like trying to investigate and determine whether or not this was A, real, and B, is it like really old? Because Chanel's like a really old company, and obviously a designer company. So that was fun. That's the moment that got me into it, the whole thing, and really got me going. And after that, my wife, like, I couldn't be stopped. Like, I got obsessed. And I guess that's sort of my personality, but I got obsessed and I wanted to find as many cool items. I just wanted to dig everywhere. I didn't even know what I was doing at the time. So I wasted a lot of money, as I did it, I just started learning stuff, and it just felt like a treasure hunt every time you went out. So I got addicted.
Where did it go from there? Like, did you initially just leave it on eBay? Did you try any other websites? Like, how did you set it up?
So the Chanel, or just in general?
Oh, I'm just talking about your thrifting business.
Oh yeah. So, well, we just started with, at the time, we just went straight with, my wife's stuff. So I just sort of supported her in what she did, started like, like, okay, you can spend a little bit more money than you did before, put money into it that wasn't just coming back from the business, stuff like that. And so for the first 6 months or so, we sort of worked together just on the side. Like, I'd go maybe a couple times a week. She'd go a couple times a week. I'd go for like when I get off of work or during lunch break or something like that. And about 6 months later, we were like, hey, I wanted to go back to school. I wanted to go finish my degree in economics. And we decided that I wanted to do that at Missouri State University in Springfield, Missouri. And my parents lived out here. So we moved the business and moved everything about 6 months into it. And when we got here, I hadn't found a job yet. And so this was like our only thing for like the first couple months for moving here. Now the cost of living here is so much cheaper than it was on the East Coast that it was like, wow, we can actually do this, profitably and, and still have a life. So that's what sort of that transition while I was working to get another job and go back to school was super perfect for thrifting because I had a lot more time on my hands. I could go out and do things and search for things. And so we had a little bit of taste of doing it full time for a couple months before I got a full-time job. And then I got a full-time job, went back to school, stuff like that. And it became part-time. But like I said, I really loved it. So I was like, man, I want to work my way into doing this full time. And that's when I started discovering other YouTubers on YouTube that were doing this full time. And this was like their life, and they were documenting on YouTube. And I was like, wow, you can actually do this full time. That sounds so crazy to me that this is a sort of a business model. I thought, for the longest time, it'd just be a little hobby thing. And so for the next couple of years, I had a full-time job. I was going to school, and I just did this whenever I could. And we scoured everywhere we could find. We started finding stuff like the $30,000 little deal. And that made a big difference, and was like, all right, this could be, we could do this. Like, I love this. This fits my personality. I remember when I first moved here, I was like, I got to get a job. And there was like a factory not too far from here that services like old vending machines. And I did that for 10 days, maybe not even 10 days, probably only 8 days. And I just couldn't do it, man. Like it was like a 6 to 4 job or something crazy like that, a 12-hour day, 6 to 6, something like that. And I remember I just went crazy. I was like, I cannot do this. Like, this repetition, that's just not my personality. Like, there's people that do it and that's great, but I can't do it. I was like, I just love the treasure.
It was too mechanical. Like, it was too mechanical.
It was just, it was like, because
repetitive.
It was repetitive. It was a I was on an assembly line. I was working like, I would tear down certain parts of these vending machines that were going to get retrofitted, and I just couldn't take it, man. Like I'd go to work before the sun rose, and then because this was like February, and I was in the factory until after the sun set, so I like hardly saw the sun, and I was like, this is mind numbing for me. Like some people, this is like, there were guys there that worked there for 40 years, and they loved it. They worked a 4-day work week, and they would just, work, drink, come back, work, drink, whatever. And I just couldn't do it. Like maybe I'm just sort of a millennial like that. I just needed more variety, but the hunt for valuable vintage clothing and valuable items was so appealing to me that I was like, I have to get to this point where I can do this full time. And so we spent as much time, if I was not at work or with my family, like I was thrifting just constantly, everywhere I could find anywhere. And that's what really got me going, really got me into the business. And it was during that time that I was like realizing I needed to, like, in order to buy the right thing, I needed to know what I was talking about. You know what I mean? Like I bought so much crap at the beginning. I didn't know anything, what had value. Like what did other people want? What was real? What was a high quality product? You know what I mean? I didn't know. And so I remember just thinking I would after that factory job, when I was back in school that semester, I got an overnight position at a therapeutic boys ranch where we took care of boys that were that needed a high level of care. And I was the overnight guy, and it was great because I've studied for school and stuff. But was also great is I sat there and watched all these YouTube videos, and I searched the internet to learn everything I possibly could about what was valuable, how to determine whether or not something was vintage. So I spent just hours in forums and stuff like that. So that season really got me like realizing I needed to learn a lot, and that's what sort of sparked all that journey into learning what vintage really was and how to identify any of it and determine whether or not it's real and valuable in the wild. So,
is your business full time now? Is this what you do full time?
This is what I do full time. And this was annoying. Like was it 2019 or 2020 is the year, all the pandemic started. And I had already started planning like in February, March, and April, or like in February, I was like, okay, I can do this full time. Our business, we are doing like something like $50,000 a year just from the part-time. And I was like, okay, I can do this full time. Like I can do it. It seems sustainable enough. I can do it. And so I remember I was like, we're prepping. I told my job in March, like, hey, I'm gonna put I put in like a 6-week notice in because the position that I was in, they needed a little bit more notice, and I like those guys, so I was really trying to help them out. And so I put my notice in, and of course, like on week 5, the world shuts down, and every thrift store from coast to coast shuts down. Everyone's closed down, locked down. I'm like, well, crap. I already put in my notice, and my last day is next week, and the whole world is shutting down. And I'm like, all right, well, I guess we'll see what happens. Like I had inventory, so I wasn't super afraid of running out. But I mean, we went full time a week after our state shut down, and so that was real exciting for the first 3 months of like, who knows when these thrift stores are really going to open up again. And so that was rough, but when we went, like, we just didn't look back, and I was like, we're just going to do it. Now that I'm full time, I had time to do YouTube, so I was like, I'm going to start YouTube back again and get that thing kicked off and really start focusing on making regular videos. And so that gave me the opportunity to do that. And so, but that first 6 months with everything, mostly being shut down and that was tense, man.
How did you work around that?
Well, we really didn't. Well, two things. One of the things is that out here in the middle of nowhere, where everyone is suspicious of the government, they did even the local government, they didn't shut down for nearly as long as some places like California or New York or something, or so they're open a little bit earlier than perhaps some of the other places around the country. So that was a little bit to my advantage, that I could still go within maybe, I want to say within a month of the initial lockdown, we were going back to most thrift stores, obviously masked and everything like that. But it took a while for some of the other ones to open up, and it's definitely took a while for them to open up in a consistent basis. So I couldn't really go beyond some of the handfuls. Like, I had to be real specific. Like, I knew that there was a couple in this town, that had said, we're going to go ahead and open up. And so they opened up and we were able to go to them. So it certainly was a time of lower inventory, but like I had mentioned, I had just found, like a couple months before that big $30,000 big haul from that random little thrift store. So I felt confident that I had the inventory to carry us through that time. So I wasn't super terrified of it, because I was like, all right, well, I have a lot of inventory. I have several thousand. I have probably, $40,000 worth of inventory just sitting now, probably more at that point too. So as long as that sells well enough, we'll get through it and get back into the groove. But it was tough. Like a lot of other people, a lot of other, YouTuber thrifters and stuff had a hard time doing the same thing because they couldn't get to the product. So mostly it was all right, we're going to batten down the hatches and make sure we have what we have. We're going to make sure that we can sell it. And so we did, and we got through it. So that was rough, but it was rough for a lot of other people too. But everyone was like buying stuff. Like, it was kind of strange. And people talk about it, is that during the pandemic, everyone shut down. They just sat on their computers. And especially when like the government starts sending money, like they had nothing to do but buy stuff. And so it was a weird period, because people really were buying a lot more stuff, even though we couldn't probably replace it as fast. There was somewhat of a strong market during that time, surprisingly, and that was not something I would have thought going into it. So that did kind of save us a little bit.
I'm really fascinated by this. Do you know of I don't know what to technically call him. I think technically he's probably an entrepreneur. Gary V. Have you heard of Gary V?
Yeah, Gary V. Yeah, Gary V. and his like obsession with garage sales. Yeah,
that's what I was like. I was watching a couple of his videos on garage sales and how he goes about like making money, and I was like, this is absolutely fascinating.
Yeah,
I was just curious, like what does your work week look like? Like, not only in terms of like hours, but like what you have to do specifically in terms of labor.
Well, as an entrepreneur, it's, people talk about the, well, I was sick of the 9 to 5. So I went so I worked for myself. Now I work 24/7. And for a guy like me who gets kind of obsessed with things, like, yeah, I'm working a lot of hours, but it's like, in my mind, I'm like, all right, every hour I put into it is an hour down the road that I won't have to work, because I'll have grown the business, or I'll have grown the YouTube channel to where it's, it makes up for it. But for the most part, because I do make up my own schedule, I can work sort of whenever I need to. So, I've got 4 kids, and so I can really be adaptive to their lifestyle. But mostly, like, I'm at at least a couple thrift stores every day. Monday through Friday. There's a handful of thrift stores I know locally that I'm going to go to every day, no matter what, and because they put out new stuff. And then 2 days out of the week, I go to a little bit further out and do a route of towns that are a little bit further out. So it's like 2 hours total length of driving, and I hit a bunch of thrift stores on those routes. And so that's typically like a Tuesday and a Thursday. And so Monday, Wednesday, Friday, I'm typically filming YouTube videos and during the bulk of the hours of that day. I do all my shipping in the morning first thing. So like every order that I have from eBay or from whatever platform that I sold it on, I do all that from like 8 to 10. Knock that out, head to thrift stores or start working on YouTube videos. Or answering questions or whatever, because I spend a lot of my time these days just answering answering vintage questions and authenticating vintage items that people send me. So I do that for the bulk of the day. And then, most of the time I can, if I wanted to, I can knock off at 5 o'clock and it's all good. But I do, as an entrepreneur, as, business owner, you realize that your lifestyle and your, success is in your hands. And so like, if you don't do it, nobody does it. Your paycheck doesn't show up unless you do the work to get it there. So, so I do spend a lot of extra time, just figuring out what else I can do, whether it's on the YouTube side of things, figuring out new things, researching. I do spend a lot of time researching. Just the other day, I had like a pile of Lee jeans in here because I was like, all right, I'm trying to crack their care tags. Like, I have a couple, my most successful videos like on YouTube are all about care tags and how to read like Levi's care tags. Well, I've been trying to crack that for Lee. So I've been like comparing and trying to decipher all these codes, these numbers that are in the back of these tags, looking for patterns. And because ironically, Lee will not tell you what they mean. Unfortunately,
you're like trying to crack the zodiac.
Yeah, so I'm like, for the last like 2 weeks, I've been spending a couple hours a day and sometimes more, just like. But now, thank God, literally a former employee of Lee contacted me like a week ago and deciphered it all. So I was like, oh man, you just saved me a bunch of time and energy and, and brain power and solving this for me. Now I have to move on to Wrangler, but, I did get Lee figured out. And so I'll be doing a video on that soon, but so that's generally how my week is that I try to keep it. I am consistent in thrift stores. Sometimes I'll go for a long period of time. But it's always changing. Like we're just like I've been talking to my wife and we've been sort of like, okay, price of gas is going really high, out here. I know it is out there.
California. Oh my God. Yeah.
Unbelievable.
It's almost $5 now.
I know. I mean, okay. I pay half that. Well, not quite half, a little more than half that, but because I'm so far from everywhere I source from, it costs a lot of money. And I'm like, okay, like I need to refine that, and to figure out whether or not it's really worth it for me every time to do that. So, and so that means like I'll spend more time talking to contacts that I've met online, other thrifters in other areas, and buy out their stock. So I've been doing that a little bit more lately. So instead of thrifting as much, but man, there's nothing that beats the rush of finding, a 1950s Levi's type 2 denim jacket in the middle of nowhere. And then just being like, wow, that's a rush for me. So I'll never stop doing it. So yeah, that's generally what the week looks like for me at the moment. So
about how many hours would you say you spend on your business a week on average?
Well, specifically the eBay stuff, like specifically,
just as a total. I guess, yeah, not including your YouTube, I should say.
Yeah, no, if I exclude YouTube and anything related to that, because I outsource some of the labor for that, I outsource photography and outsource listing. I mostly just focus on sourcing and shipping, and other management things. Right now, I'd probably only spend like 24 hours a week on it specifically. That can change depending on the week. If we get a real brand new large haul of stuff, I got to process, and I might end up doing more photos or less photos, taking some of the weight off my employee. But yeah, mostly it's it's like 24 hours of thrifting and shipping is mostly what I do. So, which is pretty cool because I can spend a lot of their time like on the YouTube stuff and the other things. Now that can change too. Like sometimes I go on week-long thrift trips where I travel thousands of miles. Like me and my buddy, I pay him to be there with me, and we go across the country. We did 118 thrift or 118 thrift stores in 6 days this summer. Across.
Where'd you go?
We went to Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, Arkansas, and Missouri, obviously. So yeah, we did basically 5 states into almost 120 thrift stores across all of those states in 6 days. And wow. we documented, we made a vlog about it. It was fun. It was worthwhile. We picked up just boatloads of stuff. But man, like that's for me, that's like a vacation almost, even though we were like 20 plus thrift stores a day, having to drive hundreds and hundreds of miles, and then make videos about it every night. Like that was just a lot of fun, for me. But that's probably not everybody, but definitely that was it for me.
So I'm really fascinated by this. So when you actually go to one of these places, let's just say, for example, like to a Goodwill.
Yeah.
How do you go about determining what to purchase? Like, how do you go about looking for what is of value?
Yeah. So some of it is you have to know, you have to have done some research beforehand. So a lot of people come to my YouTube videos because they are trying to learn what has value, trying to, be able to recognize something that has value. And that's sort of how I've geared my content for YouTube, is like, I want to show people, hey, this is what a vintage pair of Levi's looks like. These type of Levi's have value. You can resell them for, X amount of dollars. So that when you go to that thrift store and you go to the jeans section, you can pick up on, oh, hey, that's a big E Levi's red tab. I know that has value. I don't really, you may not know exactly how much value it is, but it's probably more than $4.50. You know what I mean? So more than $4.50. So you have to have learned some of that knowledge so to recognize it, because that's why these thrift stores aren't making money and selling those, or they aren't selling that particular pair of jeans for what they're worth, because they don't know what it's worth. They don't recognize it. The people that donate it probably don't know, they don't recognize it. I mean, I have found things at thrift stores worth over $1,000 several times. And it's because they probably didn't realize that pair of, Levi's 502s from 1967 were worth anything. And they just donated them because these were grandpa's jeans and they're pretty ratty and we're going to get rid of them. So when I go in, I know I know some of the stuff that I'm looking for. I know the brands that I'm looking for. I know the age. I'm looking for vintage. Not everyone looks for vintage that does this. In fact, there's a lot of people that don't do vintage at all. They just do modern clothing. I just do vintage because it's a niche that not especially around here, around where I'm living. I'm probably the only competition for vintage clothing. Like there might be one other person, and there's definitely a couple of people that are a little bit further away. But in my area, I'm probably the only one going into a thrift store looking for a particular pair of Levi's. Everybody else is looking for modern clothes or other things that they're going to resell if they're going to go to a thrift store. So because I have that sort of unique knowledge, that's sort of gives me the advantage in that area. But so I know I got to have something. I got to know what I'm looking for. And then I have to be able to recognize it in what sometimes we call it the wild, and out in the big, all these big racks of clothes. Like I have to be able to look through it and say, oh, that is a single stitch t-shirt. And that specifically, like right now with band t-shirts, like there's some band t-shirts that are worth multiple thousands of dollars, right? Like a Nirvana heart-shaped box tour t-shirt, super cool looking t-shirt. an authentic one can go for like $3,000, right? But they've reprinted that t-shirt since then. Like, you know, Hot Topic or somebody has or it might have been some other brand got a license and reprinted that t-shirt. So there are reprints out there. And so if I don't want to go buy the reprint, then try to sell it as authentic and then get in trouble because, you know, I've been selling inauthentic items, and especially for thousands of dollars. So I have to go in knowing what I'm looking for, having idea. And then if I find something that I don't know, you can use like the eBay app, and you can, all right, a pair of like Lily Pulitzer. I find a Lily Pulitzer dress. I don't really know a lot about women's Lily Pulitzer dresses, but I can tell that it has the title, and I'll type the title into eBay, and I'll give it a little brief description of what it is I'm looking for. And you can look at what's the sold comps, the sold comparables, so that I can see, hey, Lily Pulitzer actually has some value, right? Like this dress that they're selling for $5 is really probably potentially worth $100, So I can use that app and look at the comparables of what have sold previously to get an idea of what's valuable if I don't already know. At this point, for the most part, I can mostly tell most of the time. If I see something, I can at least have an inkling like, okay, that's probably worth something, just by the construction of something, just by the other markers about age, because I deal with mostly vintage. I can tell that this is old. It's probably worth something. Like today I was in the thrift store and I found a black corduroy jacket, zip up, made by the company Birdie, probably like a 70s corduroy jacket. But I don't know anything specific about that brand. Like as far as I know, they're not a big brand, but I do know that right now, like vintage corduroy jackets from the 70s, 60s, and 50s are all very popular. So I'm like, all right, so this is probably fits roughly in that age. It is the style. I can probably make some money off of this $5 jacket. So that's what I'm kind of looking for, is like, I'm looking for what I can recognize as having value. And I'm looking to recognize quality. And if I can recognize quality, but don't know much about the item, I can always search eBay and get a comparable idea of what it might be worth. So,
yeah. So I think this would probably be a good time to transition to the distinction between like what is vintage and what is true vintage. But before we do that, I just want to preface this by saying how it is that I encountered your work in the first place. So I was actually looking on eBay for a pair of Levi 501 high-rise jeans. And I think that the description had said that they were vintage. And at that point in time, I still kind of don't really know, which is why I'm interested to hear what you have to say about this. But I think it had claimed that it was vintage, but then I had learned that there's such a thing as like true vintage. Mm-hmm. And so I like went in on YouTube and typed in, Levi 501's vintage or something to that effect. And your video came up and I watched it, and I was actually able to, through your recommendation, look at the label to determine, it's not actually vintage. Okay. I think it was actually like 3 or 4 months away from being vintage, which I understood to be like, over 20 years old.
Yeah.
But maybe we should talk a little bit about that. Like, what is the distinction between vintage and true vintage, or how are these terms used?
So the term vintage in the community of vintage resellers typically means any item that's over 20 years old, right? There are some people that say that it's 18 years old, but you're talking two years difference. It's not dramatic. I made a video about this because it sort of does keep coming up. What is vintage? What is true vintage? And what is retro? Like the term retro is used a lot too. And typically that means is like people are labeling things as retro when they reference the past, but are like a brand new item. So like right now at Walmart, you can go buy a bunch of retro vintage t-shirts of these like Pink Floyd and Led Zeppelin and Van Halen. These are all they're all references of older vintage band t-shirt designs, but they're not from the 80s. You know what I mean? So there's retro, then there's vintage, and then there's true vintage. The problem sometimes with vintage is people sort of just like use it as a catch-all, particularly like on listings on eBay. And they just want to say that it's vintage because it references something that looks vintage or it's in the vintage style. And so people started using the word true vintage to distinguish between something that's sort of referencing a vintage style, but is really a new item, and what is actually 20 years old or 18 years old or more. And I think from my experience, that is probably a pretty good concept of each of those. Retro is just referencing, vintage sort of stuck in the middle. I wish it wasn't. I wish, but nobody's out there like, there's no official like legal definition of the word vintage, right? Like, and vintage is not the same in every category. Like, vintage cars are not cars that are 20 years old or more, or else we'd all be, half of us would be driving around vintage cars. Like, in vintage, in the automobile world, the term vintage means something else than it does in clothing. It's not 20 years. And that's like vintage baseball cards. Like, vintage baseball cards are specifically cards like made prior to 1981. Like, that's how the industry defines it. And that's sort of how the community agrees as to what is considered vintage. But in clothing, 20 years seems to be sort of the most reasonable. And I have theories about why that is. I think partly it's because 20 years is old enough for you to have been born, gone through adolescence, and become an adult. And then when you look back and you start making your own decisions about like what clothes you're going to buy and what you're going to wear, you're growing up making your own decisions. You look back at the style you grew up with, like when you were like a teenager or 9, 10, 11, and it's nostalgic. And so you're looking back at it being like, oh, I remember when, parachute pants were in. Like, oh, I remember when, all these vibrant colors and neon colors were cool. I remember when baggy pants were cool. I remember when saggy pants, all this stuff. Like, you look back at it, and that whole generation is sort of old enough to feel nostalgic about a certain era of fashion. And so I think it's what really sort of begins things becoming vintage. And so just because something is vintage doesn't mean it's particularly desirable, though. You know what I mean? Like, just because something is 20 years old, like a 20-year-old pair of socks or a 20-year-old pair of underwear, it's not suddenly like, oh, wow, cool, you got some vintage underwear. You know what I mean? Like, I was just having this discussion today because somebody was asking about a pair of jeans. I think they were Lee jeans, and they were probably technically vintage, right? But they're not popular. Like, they're not cool right now. So I'm like, yeah, they're technically vintage, but I just want just be careful, because just because they're vintage doesn't mean they're suddenly worth something. People have to be interested in it. Like, there have to be some level of desirability presently for it to have value. Now, it is vintage, and that's still cool in my book, because some of us vintage heads just love things that are old. Like certain styles, like the 50s is not particularly popular right now, not broadly speaking, right? I think you might start seeing some change in that, because I just saw one of the Jonas Brothers or some popular Harry Styles. What's he about? He's famous for something, but he was wearing like,
he's a musician, but I don't know if he's like in another band or what it is.
Yeah, I don't know. I just saw a picture of him, and he's like at a concert, and he's wearing like real high watered pants, like very like 60s, 50s, maybe a little bit earlier vibes. And it's like very not modern, like very not modern. And he's like wearing it on stage at one of his concerts. I'm like, oh, that's interesting. Like, that's a very specific style. And it's not from the 90s. It's not from the 80s. It's not from the 70s even. I mean, this is a much older style, but people are looking at him and he looks pretty cool. So, maybe the 50s, 40s comes back, because they all sort of cycle in waves, but yeah, so like vintage.
It seems like, I apologize for interrupting, but it seems like at this particular point, at least here in California, it seems like that late 80s, early 90s is really popular. Like I work as a professor, and if I'm looking at what my students are wearing, like a lot of them are bringing back those goddamn 90s jeans where they hang. They're very loose, particularly on the women, so there's I think they call them boyfriend jeans. It's not really tied on their ass, but it's like hanging over the shoe. And I'm like, you guys don't know what you're doing here. You don't know how that's going to look in a month when it's rainy and muddy. But then also I've noticed, like with haircuts in particular, it seems like the mullet has sort of come back in. I know that's not related to
out here. The mullet never went away. The mullet, everyone's like, man, people on the coast are wearing the mullets again. Like, finally, come no. Yeah, mullets are definitely still cool here. They always have been for whatever reason.
To be honest, this is a weird admission, but I grew up in a trailer park, but it wasn't like a trailer park like the stereotypical redneck trailer park you would have in mind. It was just kind of like an old folks trailer park. But I think that redneck thing, for whatever reason, kind of rubbed off on me a bit, because I've always wanted to have a mullet. But I know I couldn't look good at all with a mullet. But I've always wanted to have one.
I had a mullet made of dreadlocks for about 6 months.
So was it like no dreadlocks on top, but just in the back you had?
Just had the back. It was And now I wore a hat a lot back then too, so you couldn't really tell super well. But like I took it off. It was short on top, long dreads in the back, and I would like back then, because we were like really dirty, like gutter punk. We would like sew in like squirrel tails and like bones into our dreadlocks. And so, so I had a mullet for a little bit, but I could never do one of the permy, like curly or, and that stuff was not for me. It's super popular out here. Like every kid is wearing one right now, but yeah, you're right. That stuff, the 80s, like the early 90s specifically, is really, really in. And again, that's what, like 20, 30 years old. I mean, I grew up, I was like born in 1988. So the early 90s is my childhood. Like all that stuff is the stuff I saw as a kid. And I get nostalgic for it. Like you go back, you're like, oh, like I remember those days. And now everyone's sort of imitating it, and the t-shirt craze specifically. T-shirts blew up in the 80s, and in the 90s they sort of reached their like fever pitch. So everyone produced a t-shirt for everything, for TV shows, for bands, for movies, et cetera, comic books, and those are like wildly popular right now. Like if you have like Marvel did this whole t-shirt line in the early 90s with just big all over print scenes from the comic books. And these things sell for thousands of dollars. I mean, it's wild. It's unbelievable. I've had the privilege of finding a couple over the years, and they sell for tons of money. But it's crazy because you have this sort of nostalgic connection. They really become collector's pieces at that point, not just like fashionable. But there is sort of an intersection there, specifically with the t-shirts. And the t-shirt is as popular today as it's ever been. So,
I would say in the classic menswear space, I don't think that there is a craze for the 90s, but I've noticed some 90s elements working themselves back in. Like, for example, I really, really, really love wearing ties. And I've started to notice that there are particular companies that are offering tie designs that have that very 90s look to them. And they're becoming more and more popular. And I've started to be a little bit nostalgic about it myself, because I've lately been watching a show on HBO called City on the Hill. Have you heard of this show?
I've heard of it. I've never seen it though.
I highly recommend it. I mean, obviously, if you're interested in fashion, you're going to be interested in it, but it's just a really fantastic show, nonstop drama. But I've noticed like the tie designs in particular, and I'm like looking at the tie designs that are being offered now, and there's a really strong influence. I'm like, man, I started to purchase these tie designs these ties that have those tie designs, because it makes me remember that time.
I'm curious because I don't know much about ties. I find ties out there, like I'll find a Balenciaga or a Versace tie, and I'm like, oh, I know that that's valuable, or personally. But like what would you, how would you define a 90s tie? Like my head, not being someone who's a big tie guy, but they're like bigger, they're white, like was what it seemed in my mind. I remember wide ties being popular in the 90s. Would that be accurate, or am I totally missing it?
Yeah. So I'm just referring to in particular, like the designs or the patterns on the ties, but you are correct. In the 90s, the ties were significantly wider, usually between like 3 3/3 of an inch and 4 inches. And there's this interesting interaction in menswear between like the size of a tie and the design, or even the color of the tie, and actually the jackets that people wore in particular at that time. So if you look in the 90s, people were wearing jackets that were primarily black, gray, or blue. And so you got these really, really interesting tie designs because it was one of the ways that people could really bring a lot of color and design into their outfits, because everything else was very plain. So they were larger, but also like in terms of the designs, usually they had very interesting kind of like abstract prints, but some of them are like gaudy. They're very ugly and hideous, and I would never wear them. But some of the times they got it right. Like in particular, I really like the geometric tie designs. So they would be large and exploded, or sometimes they would just be very neat and interesting. But that's what I'm referring to.
Yeah, in my mind, when you said, 90s gaudy ties, I was just thinking about, you run into them all the time, but like the Looney Tunes ties that were super popular like in the 90s with all the Looney Tunes characters constantly. I had a couple friends that every time that they go to church or go to that they always wore the Looney Tunes ties. So
I think that's part of the reason why I'm slightly nostalgic for that time period, because I can remember growing up, my father, he had a tie rack and he had probably over 100 ties, and they were just all very weird and interesting. Some of them were plain and striped like you normally get, but he had those novelty ties with like all the flags of all the football teams in the NFL. But there was a concept that, was popular in tie design at that particular time. And I only know this because I spoke to an Italian tie maker named Stefano Cal. And he was saying there was this concept of a conversational tie. So the idea was that you wear a tie, and it was a way to break kind of a social barrier. You just make a comment on something, oh, that's a very interesting tie that you have. And it was a way to like talk with people, So that's why you got those really interesting tie designs.
That's interesting.
Yeah, I love it.
That's interesting because I feel like this business casual has sort of taken over workspaces. Like people aren't wearing ties as often or they're not wearing very, very formal wear as often to go like work in Silicon Valley. There are dressed down to some degree. So, but you're right. It's interesting because I grew up, my grandfather, he had every tie he had a whole like closet full of ties, like it was just for ties. It was nuts. And I remember when he died, we got a bunch of them. I still have a bunch just stored away. But it really was, you're right. That was just a way like people use tennis shoes now, like as just, it's just one small way they express themselves and they started conversations. So that's really interesting. I hadn't really thought about conversational ties, but that's a pretty fascinating concept. I'm curious what, if there is an analog for today. Maybe the tie is still like that, but I haven't seen many people wear the Looney Tunes ties in quite a while. So
I don't know if they're sufficiently popular to actually work as icebreakers. You're actually, I don't know. A lot of people look at me when I wear a tie, and I don't know if it's I don't know if it's
like about that guy or
I'm a rare species, and they're like, what is this? Who let this person loose? Or if it's like they actually find what I'm wearing fascinating. So I don't know to what extent it could actually like work as a icebreaker now, but there's got to be something that people wear that's common now. Maybe people use like necklaces or watches or something like that.
Watch. Oh man, I love watches, but
I know she have a watch on there. What do you got on?
I have just a cheap Emporio Armani quartz watch.
That's it does a job. It does a job.
It does a job. It's my everyday sort of. I've got another Armani that I like, an automatic, and that I wear when it's nice out, or when I'm supposed to be nice wherever I'm going.
Did you find that vintaging?
No, I wish I did. Now, I'll tell you what.
Is that even a term? Did I just make up a term? Vintaging?
Vintaging? Maybe. Quite possibly. I'll tell you what. I like watches a lot. I don't have a ton myself. I wish I did. But it was funny because I was thinking, I realized like, man, I go to thrift stores all the time. I need to learn watches in case I run across some fancy old watches. I'd love to find an old Omega, or you're never going to find a real Rolex in a thrift store. I just don't think it's going to happen. They're too people recognize the branding. But I'm like, some of these older brands that people aren't as aware of, like Omega or something like that, or maybe you'll find some of those. But no. Like I've looked long and hard at piles of watches at thrift stores and never found a single, or flea market, never found a single valuable. I think I may have found like a couple of. Over the years I found maybe a couple of some like cool Timex, older Timex ones, but nothing particularly interesting. So I'd love to find. I'd love to get into watches. They're so much fun. So, but they're not at their stores. People, I think most of the time know what they're doing when they're donating watches. They know that they're going to pass it on if it's valuable to their family members or something like that. So,
yeah.
But one day, fingers crossed, I'll find something out there that was worth writing home about.
Never know when you're treasure hunting.
Yeah, you don't. And that's, you just don't know. And, as much as I've come across random stuff, it'll eventually happen, I suppose. So I'm sure somebody has found a valuable watch at a thrift store for like $20 or something, but not me. So,
yeah. Unfortunately. So what are some of the more interesting items that, you go to a lot of interesting places. Yeah. So maybe we should take a little bit of time to talk about some of them independently. Yeah. Like, I'm really curious what your best find was at an estate sale, right? So estate sales after someone dies, right?
Yeah, estate sale after someone dies. Typically, not all the time. Typically after an estate, or somebody like move, like if a lot of times they've passed away. Sometimes it's just like they're moving into a long-term care facility, and so their family just liquidates their stuff. But typically it's when they've passed. And so at an estate sale, I'm trying to think. My best find, I actually might have it in the other room. Let me look real fast.
Yeah, no worries.
This actually, this is not maybe the most valuable find, but it's one of my favorite finds, and it's this blanket, and it's from the Hudson Bay Company. They were like early fur trading companies, back like up in Canada. And they would like denote how many pelts it took to make that particular blanket by these notches. So this would have been like 4 pelts of beaver fur originally to make one of these. That's not what it means now, but this is from like the 1930s. And nobody knew what it was worth, because it's probably worth a couple $100. I got it for 50 cents. So
what is it made of?
It's made of wool. It's made of it's a real warm blanket. It's got a couple holes in it, unfortunately, but it's like from the 1930s. So it's almost 100 years old, almost technically an antique, because antique has a pretty clear definition of about 100 years. But so it was a lot of fun. It was like, I was there. Nobody else knew what they were talking about, and nobody bought it. And I was like, hey, I want that. And it was like 50 cents. So, yeah, from an estate sale, it was probably the best one I found. So one of the cooler things I found. Some people do, like, when I think of something, my best finds at certain places aren't always the ones that are the most valuable. To me, like, it's about the history of the item, how old the item is it rare, is it interesting, so like my best finds could be valuable, but when it comes down to it, if I'm making a list, it's like the stuff that was the most interesting or unusual or bizarre. Sometimes it's the most valuable thing, but most of the time it's something that's just like something that was really interesting, like that blanket. No, I didn't. nobody else knew what that blanket was. Like they didn't recognize it as having any value. But I was, through the, what I had learned, that I was like, oh, this is a valuable, old, high quality blanket. That's cool to me. Like to find these random things that people are not paying attention to. So, but yeah, at an estate sale, that's definitely the best thing. But as far as like any other places, like,
that's what I was going to ask about. What about other places? Like what are just some of your favorite finds from anywhere?
So, so my best, probably the best money find, the best like single most valuable thing that I've ever found. Well, there's probably two. First one, which is it was a menswear item. It was a new with tags Salvatore Ferragamo camel hair full trench, brand new with tags. The tags, the retail price on the tag was $3,500, and I picked it up at like it was like a Goodwill or something. It was like half off day, so it was like $2.50. No joke. It was my birthday that day, actually. It's like, oh my gosh, like the Lord has blessed me. Oh my gosh, this is crazy.
What did you resell it for?
I think we sold it because, of course, these big designer companies like Ferragamo have an incentive to make their items look way more valuable than they maybe are, but like in the real market. I think we sold it for like $800, $900, something like that. I mean, it was a really good flip in terms of like the margin is nuts,
right?
But and maybe I could have sold it for more. I don't really know. I think I saw one that had sold for like $1,400 on the Real, which if you're not familiar with the Real, they're like an eBay, but for high-end designer clothing. But they also do the authentication. So you send them the item, they authenticate it, and then sell it for you on consignment. So it's a big giant consignment website. You can get a lot of great high quality items of clothing there for a good price. But when you resell it, they're going to take about like 45% of the sale. Wow. So when I looked at it, like I could sell it myself and, probably make a little bit more than I could have if I gave it to them. But that was really fun. It's like in terms of like just monetary value and, crazy valuable piece for a crazy low amount of money. My favorite though, and it was definitely the highest value item I'd ever found, and it still is to this day, I think, single item, was actually from Facebook Marketplace. I was on Facebook Marketplace, and that's one of the places I do sometimes go to look for things that I want to buy. People selling old jackets or something like that. In this case, it was an old Levi's Type 2 selvage denim jacket from the 1950s. They only made the Type 2 for about a little bit more, like 10 years or so, like in the 50s to the 60s, like 62. The Type 1 they did for several decades prior to that. And then the Type 3, which is sort of the one that everybody's familiar with. It's this one right here. This is the Type 3. Like it's got that the triangle there. I mean, this is the trucker jacket everyone's familiar with. But the Type 2 doesn't have those sort of V things. It's the sort of predecessor to this jacket. And I found it online, somebody about an hour away selling it. And they wanted like $300 for it. And I was just like, man, I didn't know if they knew what they had, if they were just like saying a high number. And I was like, hey, could you, would you be willing to trade anything for it? Like just, maybe bring the price down or something. Like, yeah, what do you got? And I was like, and I just sort of was thinking, I was like, okay, they're not looking for clothes. What do they might be looking for? It's like, I have an old broken down car in my front yard with, just trying. I'm like, yeah, I'll take it. So I was like, what? And so I had this old car that hadn't been running, that had just sat there forever. And so I was like, okay, me and my buddy will tow it over. We brought it over, and he probably scrapped it, I guess, for a couple $100 maybe.
Yeah.
But I was
gonna say maybe sell it for parts, but I don't know.
Yeah,
how many parts would be worth.
he didn't seem like he was like a particularly mechanical guy. I just think he was like, oh, I can get a car instead of having an old dirty denim jacket. But I sold that jacket for like $1,500. Like,
wow.
Yeah. So it was definitely the single highest item that I'd found outside of some of those big bulk finds of a bunch of different things that I've had. But single item, it was definitely, and it sort of takes the cake for both the most valuable item and one of the most interesting items, because it was, I mean, I do love Levi's. Levi's is like my favorite brand for vintage stuff. I spend a lot of my time studying, really trying to understand the vintage history of Levi's. And so to find that out in the, just sort of random trade a type 2 really rare jacket was a lot of fun. And like, unfortunately that was before I was really doing YouTube a lot, so I didn't get to document the story because it was pretty wild. But it was definitely the single coolest find that was the most interesting to me that I'd ever found individually.
Yeah, I really love Levi's Western shirts. I actually
those are
a couple months ago picked one up. Maybe I should go ahead and grab that. Maybe we can do a little analysis of it. But cool. I didn't buy it because it was vintage. I just really love the sawtooth pockets. But let me go ahead and grab that real quick.
Yeah, that'd be awesome.
Oh, stick these back on. Yeah, I highly doubt that it's vintage. It seems like it's in pretty good good condition.
Yeah, that's one of the modern ones. You can tell specifically by the that tag style. But it's still, it might actually be one of the higher quality ones. I don't know whether or not see, that's denim, right?
Yeah.
It's
pretty heavy, quite hefty.
I know, that's like, those are so cool. Those are great shirts, because they used to be, wait a minute. Hey, bring that a little bit closer. Is that a selvage edge inside that? Flip the front, right there. Oh yeah, they use selvage denim. That is a higher end version of it.
Yeah, I think I got this for like $35. I think it was.
It looks like a selvage edge on that, the denim that they use. So this was probably one of the higher end modern Levi's pieces.
I was a little disappointed because I noticed the top button here, they actually have a mother of pearl button. I don't know if that's standard on some of their Western shirts, but it seemed to me like if it was one of these pearl snap buttons, then there would have been a round thing right there where I could see it, but it doesn't look like that's the case.
Yeah, I think they do that because that's a button that often gets replaced. So it's frequently it'll pop but I don't know. That's an interesting question, but that's a really cool. That's a cool piece. Like,
are we able to figure out how when it was made?
It's possible. The newer stuff is not always as simple. There may be along the side, down inside that seam along the arms. Yeah, right there.
This tag doesn't have anything on it. It's blank. It just has the button.
It's tough. The modern stuff is not always as simple as some of the older stuff is. I'd have to look pretty closely. You can send me pictures of it closer up, and I could probably take a look. Oftentimes, at least with some of the jeans, even to this day, they have there's a code on one of those interior tags that has a date of production. I believe they've moved to a different standard. I'm not super like, I don't know a ton about the modern stuff because they've changed a lot in the last like 10 years. Even like they've added, like if you look at the modern Levi's jean tags on the back, there's like 7 of them. So there's a lot more random information. But one of them typically still is, I believe, a year and the week of the year that it was made. So you could see it's typically a 4-digit number that'll have like maybe like a 17 and a 46 for the 46th week of the year, something like that.
Yeah, that's one of the points you made in the video you had on the Levi 501s. I was actually able to check that out on mine. I think that they were like, it would have been 2001. They made some point in 2001, but I remember when I looked at it, it was like, oh yeah, this is about 3 or 4 months away from being actually vintage, 20 years vintage.
Technically vintage, yeah. And so you could that system that they used pretty much remained unchanged until about the 2010s. And that was actually sort of a rough season for Levi's. They really redid a lot of stuff. They were having their sales were down at the end of the what they call it, the knots, the 2000 knots, and or aughts, something like that. And so they really did a whole lot of stuff coming back out and like changing lots of stuff, adding a lot of things. But until then, they still used the 4-digit date code, which was like month and year. It was fairly simple to discern whether or not your particular Levi's piece was produced in one specific year. And that system really works all the way up into the mid to early 70s, where care tags were a sort of a new thing that was required by law. Like washing instructions were instructed by law to be included on garments of clothes. So you can use that roughly to get an idea of whether or not your item is older than 1971, 73, by just by telling whether or not it has a wash instructions tag. Companies did include them prior to that in some degree, but it wasn't required by law. So whenever you're looking at a garment that may be older than 1971, you look for if it has care tags, and if it has specific wash instructions, you can be fairly confident it's probably younger than the 1971 time period. Again, some brands did include wash instructions prior to that, but it wasn't a requirement by law, so there were many that did not. So all the different little pieces of information you can learn about. I'm waiting. I've been looking for it because I would assume like somebody has had to have done, and I don't know if this is really a thing, but someone's had to have done their like thesis, or their doctoral paper on the history of clothing and stuff like this. I'm trying to find somebody who's got that paper that they did and published at some random university so that I can really get down to the nitty-gritty of some of this stuff. So because the history is so convoluted, they did not have a whole lot of reason to write all this stuff down and keep super good, high quality, detailed information. Like I ask questions to Levi's that Levi's doesn't know the answer to. I have a couple of people that I contact in Levi's, and there's things that just don't know. Like, I don't know what we did. We don't have any record of it. It's like, oh, all right. Well, I guess that's multinational manufacturing for you. It's just so it takes the community of good guesses to sort of get down to clear up some of these different rules, so to speak, on how to identify something that is vintage or not. So yeah, it can be very confusing and controversial within a small community. So
all righty, so we're closing in on an hour and a half now, so we got to get going pretty soon, but I just want to say thank you very much for coming on and speaking with me. I greatly appreciate it. But for those who don't already know who you are or follow you, where can they find you?
You can find me on YouTube at Loot Fam. That's our YouTube page. So search YouTube for LOOTFAM, or you can find me on Instagram at Loot Fam Vintage or Loot Fam VTG. I post there sometimes. I'm not super great at Instagram. I should be better. I'm supposed to be a millennial and be hip on this stuff, but man, I can only keep up with so many social networks. But the videos on YouTube are where I do most of my work, as far as vintage education and helping people understand how old their items really are and get a confirmation of it. So that's probably where the most interesting stuff is.
What about your shop on eBay? Are they able to actually look that up?
You can look that up. It's it's because it's old, because we've had it for a long time. It's Bella Home Boutique on eBay. You can search on their search website and find us that way. And we've got over 1,000 some odd mostly vintage items on there. So if we're looking for vintage Levi's like that, you can find a good deal for sure.
Alrighty. And I'll make sure to go ahead and put those down in the description below so they can find you. So yeah, once again, just thank you very much for coming on and speaking with me. Pleasure. I greatly appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks, Barry. It's good to be here.
Have a fantastic day.
All right. You too, man.